breaks my heart to say that we've come so far. We're almost at the end. This is our last presentation. That's hard to believe. But I'm very excited to present to you. I'd like you to give a very warm welcome to John and Penn.
Good morning. I'm honored to be up here closing out in the last session of NSNorth 2015. I like to tell myself that this makes me the headline actor of the conference. You know? Now you all, however, are likely thinking of me as the next barrier to lunch. So I totally understand. Differing perspectives of the same data point. It's complicated stuff. And it ties nicely into my theme. I am fascinated by personal stories, like Ash, I'm a people watcher. It's a lot of fun. I'm fascinated by the stories that we tell ourselves over and over again. They shape the questions we ask, and they affect what we see as obvious. They stick to us like a residue, and end up guiding us when we face uncertainty and doubt. And if you will indulge me, I'd like to begin my talk about our personal mythologies with a story of my own. This is Naya, my 5-year-old daughter, and I feel the same pressures that every parent does to introduce their children to the high cultural experiences that one has growing up. So of course, I chose to show them Star Wars. I had no idea how pervasive this would be throughout the conference. Seriously, it's all off the cuff. So in our house, we talk a lot about heroes and villains. I hope I'm demonstrating good decisions about fighting evil, rescuing the oppressed, and all that jazz. And yes, Star Wars, like most pop culture fare, is a gross oversimplification of the world. What's that? Lightsabers and spaceships? What's not to like, right? One day our family was reflecting a bit on the story after watching it again, and we're asking each other questions like, what kind of character do you want, stuff like that. And she pipes up and says, Daddy, who would you be in the movie? And then I make some sage-like comment about being Obi-Wan Kenobi, who guides the young hero through his challenges on the way to confronting them. It's way over the kid's head. She doesn't know what I'm talking about. And then I turn to her and say, so Naya, who would you be? And I'm half expecting her 5-year-old mind to pick the most obvious choice in a movie with only one character identifying as a woman. But no. Her response, Daddy, I want to be Emperor Palpatine. And she says it just like that too. It's adorable. The Emperor Palpatine, oh my gosh, it's kind of dark. Sorry for the slides here. But yeah, it is a dark thing. So it is the dark side after all. Emperor Palpatine in all of his spooky glory here is the supreme ruler of the ambitiously named Galactic Empire. He's ruthless, cunning, belligerent, patronizing, and apparently worth emulating by a 5-year-old. So I believe I am doing my best to demonstrate to our children that we should not aspire to be intergalactic despots. I'm a little concerned, and I'd like to know more about what's going on and answer some more questions. And it turns out, she doesn't understand the trite good and evil struggle in the movie at this point in her life. She sees the rest of us picking characters based on visible defects and attributes. Luke's got a lightsaber, Yoda lifts spaceships out of swamps, and Palpatine? Oh, well, imagine him. He's got a cape and a hood, and he shoots lightning. Dude, to her, this is awesome. And it suddenly becomes clear to me why she keeps running around the house pretending to have lightning powers, yelling, Palpatine! She thinks she's Emperor Palpatine. And her favorite song from the soundtrack is the Imperial March. At some point, she's going to realize that her hero her role model is actually the villain. He's not using his power to help. But at this moment in her life, the fragments of the story somehow weave into the stories that she tells about herself. The character speaks to her and gives her confidence. What could possibly go wrong? That's another picture of Palpatine. Forgive the darkness. It is the dark side after all. We are creatures shaped by stories. We all have these myths, storified explanations of events that guide us and give us purpose. Now, as an insult, myth is often used to accuse something of being untrue, but that's just a colloquial way of using the word. At its core, the word communicates tradition, continuity, identity. It's the backstory behind the relationship we have to the world and to each other. Now, usually when we think of myths, we might think of epic voyages or mystical creation stories, but it is so much more fun and pervasive than that. Myths play those important roles in our lives that bind us together into little communities. The buzzwords, catchphrases, the memes of myths, they form this signaling language to let someone know that you're safe with me. Or to let others know that you should stay away. So, myths play a rhythmic and liturgical kind of role in our lives. It's call and response. We feed back and forth with each other as we signal. If I shout out, Valar Morghulis, someone in the room is bound to respond. Thank you. And you and I will commiserate about the pain of waiting for season 5 of our better shit. So there you go. Pictures may be worth 1,000 words, but the signals of a myth are worth a lifetime of emotions chained together. And only one person in this room gets that joke, so there you go. When you have myths in common with the people around you, it is comforting and powerful. It just feels right. It breeds confidence because of the natural tendencies that we have in our species. A good term for this phenomenon is the German word zeitgeist. And I think it's a useful word for us here because it literally translates as the spirit of the age. It communicates this idea that the catchphrases, the admonitions, the inside jokes, they all are part of this fabric of what we share in common with the spirit of the age. The zeitgeist has a life of its own, and it feeds back into us and changes us as a result. And this is part of the reason I shared Star Wars with my children. Now, as far as space operas go, it is objectively quite cheesy. But the story happens to be important to me because of when it showed up on the timeline of my life. I was learning about space, reality and fiction. I wanted a lightsaber so bad I was going to build my own. I wanted to use the Force on the playground to stop bullies. Deep existential problems for a child at the time. And my kids are going to grow up and they're going to develop their own tastes and identities. They're probably going to say, Dad, that's all boring stuff you do with Star Wars. But in this moment, we have something in common. We share a similar language, together, a language of continuity, fear, adventure, silliness. It's part of the story that we're telling ourselves together as a family. And where the zeitgeist sees possibility and hope, there's much less friction to move. It's like grease that enables us. And that's why we often encourage finding communities that support your same goals. Ignore the critics. Find your crowd. This works in our favor much of the time. Bad habits are really hard to break if everyone around you is pushing you back into them. Sometimes change requires breaking old relationships, choosing new friends, and starting a new story that then feeds back into our lives. Myths are an important part of us as a species, and in our modern age, we like to imagine ourselves as these clean, objective, and reasonable creatures. But I hope through the course of this talk that we don't try to pretend this is so. We are sticky and soaked in stories, and those stories don't always have happy endings. So this here is my 7-year-old son, Ian. Last spring, my family went camping in the Hockey Hills in southern Ohio. And unfortunately, we picked a weekend with severe thunderstorms, so we had to spend most of the time in a nearby town at a thrift store, basically trying to stay dry. I don't know if thrift store is just an American expression or not. It's the place you donate all your little stuff you don't want to, and then they turn around and sell it. And my kids love thrift stores. It's like this wonderland of adventure, lost and forgotten things. So while we were there, Ian found this lightsaber. And this was just, this was just a couple of weeks after we had seen the first movie. And if you remember, this lightsaber only had a tiny bit of screen time. Look at this. The mystery of this weapon is intoxicating. It transports you to a galaxy far, far away. Wait for it. Wait for it. Busted. But you can see where he gets it. This is the tail end of a 15-minute dance around the store like some sword fighter from Bravos, totally and completely engrossed in a story that he made up. And I'm quite proud of him. He only bumped into one customer the whole time. So in recent months, Ian has shown a great interest in weapons, no surprise, and war. Every time we watch the rebels fight back against the evil empire, he asks all sorts of questions about the conflict. Many of them are quite astute, like, Daddy, why does the empire have so many stormtroopers who can't aim? You can't get things past 7-year-olds, it's amazing. And I'm shocked, as most parents are when they encounter the intelligence of their children. But many of his questions deal a bit with his own fears, too, and how he's trying to process the tension of a war. And the most interesting conversation with him ended with something like this. When he thought he knew what to do. He said, "Daddy, I know what I would have done in this situation. If I was in charge of a war, I would build the biggest gun. Bigger than anyone else's gun. Bigger than the Death Star's gun. And if I built the biggest gun ever, bigger than anyone else, wouldn't I win?" Well, so J. Robert Oppenheimer was the director of the Manhattan Project that cracked open the secrets of the atom and produced the first nuclear bombs. So he was a brilliant physicist and a spokesman for science among all the stakeholders of the project. So think back to the time they were in. This is during the Second World War, another great war that they didn't even think was possible. And the atomic bomb was about to change everything. Warfare wasn't conventional anymore. It was now about wielding a power so great you could devastate a region in seconds and it wouldn't be inhabitable for decades or more. It was hard to imagine for them back then. The scientists in this project were fascinated by the physics of atomic energy. This was a remarkable time. But many were concerned about introducing this power to humanity in the form of a bomb. And Oppenheimer adopted a role in between the scientists who tried to remain neutral in their work and the military leaders that excited that, hey, this is how you stop an even empire. When tensions ran high, Oppenheimer took the stage to mediate, pushed back on the military bureaucracy to give the scientists more freedom, and he painted a mental picture to the scientists there about how their work just couldn't stop. Oppenheimer honestly believed and hoped that once the destructive power was demonstrated, it would short-circuit future wars. Humanity would realize that escalating conflict would be too great. No one would really use these weapons out in the open, right? The atomic bomb is so terrible a weapon that war, in general, is now impossible. Linda Walsh, who teaches at the University of Nevada-Reno, studies this phenomenon, the rhetoric of science. And she wrote this book, fascinating book called Scientists as Prophets, which follows several popular science advisors and how they step into this role to create certainty in the middle of terrifying chaos. When there was serious doubt about whether to continue their work, Oppenheimer comforted his fellow scientists with powerful stories about what they were working toward together as a community. He invoked their allegiance to science and collaboration. I believed in him. That was a common refrain in the records at the time, when you read the journals and other documents that have been declassified. Everyone was terrified, and this was a new territory, and they wanted certainty about their goals just as much as they wanted to see the atomic power at work with their very own eyes. What Walsh demonstrates is that it's not knowledge as some abstract thing that moves society. It's rhetoric and storytelling. As scary as that is, I mean, we like to think of ourselves as these fully autonomous decision-making units. But even if you're an expert in something, in a particular field, with a time to devote to it, I mean, what about everything else? Most of the critical decisions that we think are so important in our lives that we make, they're based on trust and summaries, not actual data. How many of you actually read the open SSL source code when the Heartbleed vulnerability came to light? Me neither. Oh, one person, there you go. Did you read all of it? Exactly, okay? Thank you for bringing my point. I mean, how do you really know what happens to your precious privacy that we so vainly try to protect? I mean, we pick news sources to trust. And we say, okay, they said it's going to be all right. We pick, maybe have a friend in the White Hat community. Is this going to be okay? Okay. And then we hope things are going to work out. That's just what humans do. Oppenheimer's code was tested on July 16, 1945, near the town of Alamogordo, New Mexico. They tried out the bomb for the first time, and it was a spectacular sight. A massive fireball that shook everything around them. It defined a new category that didn't exist in the mind's eye before. Atomic explosions are a dime a dozen these days. In our imagination. I mean, that's one of the challenges of reading history, is trying to connect with the emotion at the time. It just seems so quaint back then. So set these images aside and put yourself into the story they were living in. This was the first, and this was terrifying. Shaken by this experience, Oppenheimer was interviewed later about how he felt at this moment. And a story from the Hindu scriptures in the Bhagavad Gita came to mind with the phrase, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The power they had built was now out of their control, taking on a life of its own. The Cold War began, other nations now clamoring to build this power for themselves. Complicated stuff. I mean, we take a lot of this moment, a lot of this era for granted. Today's folk tales about the awesome, frightening power of scientific discovery, it has a lot of its roots in this time period. This moment is when the modern, mythical, apocalyptic science anti-hero was born. This myth fills our stories today. You can't find zombie apocalypse not man-made anymore. Not what it used to be. Now, look here, the Watchmen didn't even have a very subtle allusion to Oppenheimer himself, their hero. And I'm not arguing at all, don't take this the wrong way. I'm not arguing that we shouldn't do things even if they have a dangerous side to them, or should avoid these amazing powers that work with it. What I'm arguing is that it helps to reflect on the spirit of the age that influences us as we keep building with hope that it's all going to work out in the end. The stories we live within and repeat to ourselves, they shape the questions we ask, and they affect what we see as obvious. As a side note, and speaking of comic book heroes, I'm fascinated by the mythical stature that mutations have in our midst. I mean, they're so awesome. Look at them. A personal development, great, coming in handy at just the right time. Our perception of mutation reflects values of our Western society where we have historically privileged the individual over the group. But mutations don't work this way at all. Adaptation is always an exchange. And the actual mechanics of adaptation involve death, generations of time, harsh competition, collaboration between organisms. A population adapts with mutation over time. The individual is just along for the ride. I know. It's tough to make blockbuster movie out of this narrative. More lightsabers and less flair. Let's do it. Yeah. So I recommend reading biographies about most recently I read American Prometheus, which gave a complicated picture of his allegiance to science and his internal struggle through all of this stuff that he had to deal with. It's a very human treatment of him, and I really appreciate it. After World War II, he applied his expertise and his rhetorical power during the Cold War to again do what he thought was right. He confronted the secrecy around atomic weapons programs and spoke to the American public directly, going around the government, believing that transparency from the government, that's a new idea, but that was now the only way for humanity not to destroy itself. But people more powerful than him destroyed his career for it. But remember the time. Within the spirit of the age, to question the authorities about nuclear weapons was considered treason. There was a war going on after all, and the MacArthur-era witch hunts were just getting started. Look it up on Wikipedia for a good time. And speaking of witch hunts, that's a fascinating phrase that has its roots in, funny story, actually hunting for witches. Frenetic inquisitions by scared mobs where the only defense is to plead guilty and give up, even if it didn't really happen. I mean, indeed, witch hunt is one of those catchphrases we use that communicates and signals this fear of fanaticism. Kind of like what happened to Oppenheimer. Now, Alberto Toscano wrote an interesting book on the larger phenomenon behind this human thing called fanaticism, fanaticism on the uses of an idea. And in today's headlines, fanaticism, in our zeitgeist, fanaticism is often linked with religion as a matter of course. And myths pop up like, if we just got rid of religion, we would be all better off. Now, I happen to have a master's of arts in religion, so I can speak with some authority on this, and I totally see where that myth is coming from. Not just witch hunts, many other stories throughout history, even uncomfortable stories within Christianity's history, where I happen to come from and will study. I myself am afraid of religious groups that tell themselves stories about being above question by outsider, closest to the divine, absolute in their certainty, so absolute that there isn't any doubt, let alone room for faith, humility, or wonder. But in spite of all that, religion is not a necessary condition for this phenomenon. And Toscano dispels that myth and does a terrifying job, pointing out that the underlying mechanisms that do this spans cultures and pops up like mushrooms attached to seats of power, whatever zeitgeist happens to be operating at the time. I mean, think about it. What makes someone a charismatic leader? Charismatic happens to be a root word from religious circles. It's inspiring, challenging, obsessed with detail. We tell ourselves these stories, but that mechanism has a light and a dark side. What makes us seek out heroes to admire and emulate that we want to be like? Well, it's the same mechanism, shares mechanisms behind groupthink, apathy, and mob oppression. For example, take the book, What Makes a Hero? The Surprising Science of Selflessness by Elizabeth Svoboda. It collects the latest research into how altruism works. I found it fascinating, particularly because it's a mix of distilling the research and interviewing the actual researchers. I kind of like that, because sometimes we have we say a study show, and we kind of put this austere veil of scientific research, and we don't quite understand what goes on behind the scenes. In fact, a common theme throughout the book is how the personal stories of the scientists affect their topics of research and what they think. Like the story behind the Stanford prison study by Dr. Phillips and Bardo. The study is widely cited. You probably have heard parts of this piece of it before, like I have. And in 1971, Dr. Zimbardo wanted to understand the psychological pressures for people when they're placed in positions of authority or under authority. So he set up a 2-week study and chose 24 healthy male students, divided them up into prisoners and prison guards, and granted them full authority. 9 rings were gifted to the race of men, with all else desired power. Check the secret. But unfortunately, I'm only half joking. Now, what happened next was stunning and uncomfortable. The guards, believing stories about themselves, they were instructed to maintain order, but they believed they should impose strict rules and limits on what the prisoners could do. And of course, the prisoners pushed back, as people do. A cycle began. Frustration and abuse escalated, with students being forced to strip naked in shame, and among many other things I'm not going to talk about here in public, that were done to assert dominance and crush their dignity. Now, that part of the story I had already heard before. But so I want to interview Dr. Zimbardo for her book and share more details about the impact of this landmark study on him that I hadn't heard. Zimbardo said that he got caught up in the whole mess himself. It was hard for him to see how he affected it as the authority giving the study, and how bad things had gotten. The study was supposed to last for 2 whole weeks. There were 50 people involved in one way or another, but only one person stood up throughout the entire process to question the morality of where things had gotten to. Dr. Christina Maslach, a fellow social psychologist, challenged Dr. Zimbardo to a point that got really uncomfortable and emotional. But it took that emotional breaking point for him to snap out of the story he was telling himself and see things differently. The next day, he ended the study. Wasn't going to go on anymore. Only 6 days after it started. Still, even in spite of that, it wasn't a failure. The results made a big splash. He became a household name on how authority can go awry. He even wrote a book called The Lucifer Effect. Yeah, talk about invoking mythological figures for a point. And he was sought after to discuss the situations like Abu Ghraib, the abuses that went on Abu Ghraib, and has been brought up again in the situations like in Ferguson, Missouri. After all this notoriety died down in his first wave here, he remembers this confrontation by Dr. Maslach, both surprised and impressed that she was the only person who stood up to him. And he asks a new question now. That's interesting. What makes someone take severe social risks to stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves? As a result of that question, he now studies the mechanisms behind courage and is contributing to a body of work in the Heroic Imagination Project. Instead of focusing on negative influences like conformity, bystander effect, and all that stuff, he wants now to try to catalog the positive influences that move us. And, without surprise, imagination. How you see yourself plays a very large part of that. And in many ways, we're like a greedy algorithm that finds the local maxima in a vast solution space. And when we get stuck, and we can't see any farther because we found the best local answer in the subset of data we chose to evaluate. We sometimes need randomness injected into our starting conditions. Maybe we should listen to a story that doesn't confirm what we wanted or expected to hear. I've cited a lot of books, I know, sorry about that, but I actually believe very strongly in bibliographies. If you walk away with only one book to read out of this talk, I would recommend this one, The Myths of Innovation by Scott Berkman. It ties in well to the work that you're all in technology. He pokes holes into all sorts of sacred sayings that we repeat back and forth to each other. Things like, the best ideas will win. Shipping is the only way to get things done, and hard work always pays off. Instead, he paints this uncomfortable, rough, interconnected picture of how even the great mythical inventors were stumbling onto their discoveries while standing on the shoulders of others before. He encourages the reader to enter into that line of succession and see themselves within the larger story of human adaptation. Mythology is not a disease, although it may, like all human things, become diseased. I share Tolkien's sentiment. Our myths stay healthy because we nourish them to keep them so. I personally believe that we should expose ourselves to as many stories as possible, even to an uncomfortable degree. Not necessarily to change your mind. I mean, you can still believe you were right before. That is what humans tend to do anyway. But now, at this point, you will ask different questions of the stories you've already chosen to guide you, at the very least. I mean, what better way to combat monoculture in the imagination than by expanding the ecosystem defeated? A diverse biological ecosystem is what helps life thrive. The organisms are able to protect each other. Genetic diversity fights the spread of disease. The offspring are more robust in the face of disaster. I say the same about imagination. The stories we repeat to ourselves, they shape the questions we ask, and they affect what we see as obvious. Thank you. And may the force be with you.
That was excellent, John. Do you have any questions for John?
How do you stumble upon books like these?
Where are you?
Sorry, maybe.
Okay, good. All right.
Where are you finding your reading this?
That's a good question. Oh, thank you for that. A few resources. One is I have people who read a lot more than I do, and I would consider much smarter than me. And when I talk with them, they're like, "Oh, you heard of this?" And no, I haven't. And sometimes I just let things drop on the floor, and other things catch my attention. I also, with my master's, I was very interested in reading a lot of things related to history and identity and the way people see ourselves. So a lot of the stuff kind of came out of that interest, and that's why I picked certain books because it seemed like it related to that. But if you want a really easy bibliography, in fact, I would consider Maria Popova the bibliographer for the world. Brainpickings.org is phenomenal.
Yeah.
Your head will hurt when you go and read her stuff, and she writes a lot, but I highly recommend it. It's a great place to find a broad spectrum of interconnected parts, and she does a great job cross-linking between books that she's read. So. I've got a thumbs up from Robert. So there you go.
Maybe one more question? Can you post the bibliography, like, somewhere?
Sure, yeah, sure.
That's fine.
We'll do that. Thanks.
Well, what a fabulous way to end our talks. Let's give a huge hand for John. So, we have lunch ready aside, but we'd really like y'all to meet us outside the terrace to get a group photo. Martin, does that work? Okay. Alright, so it'll only take 5-10 minutes. We'll try and get everybody lined up right in front of the building, right outside. We'll let our eyes adjust, as I'm sure